change a few settings, a couple problems. Trying to make sure Twitch works properly. Looks like it is. It's got a little glitch right there, but looks like we're past it. So this is going to be the routine, hopefully, for the next 3 months we're going for, where it's wake up, take care of the dogs, get them fed and walked, go to the gym, come home, eat, chill for a little bit, and then start this stream, usually earlier, but I did have some technical issues today, and then start playing, and then finish up this stream about 1 or 2, and start playing by 3 o'clock on a different stream. And we're going to try to bang through all this. These are my goals for the next 100 days, which I'm going to make a vlog out of. If you guys want to see that, please let me know. I'm just taking the raw footage, and I'm going to see if anything comes of it. So, we're on part 5 of the Tournament Masterclass. This is when facing a bet on the flop. Example 743, we're going to try to finish this section today, but I do have my in-laws coming over to drop off Christmas presents and say hi, so I may have to cut this one short or do it in 2 parts today. But either way, let's just get into it and make sure this is working and that is off. And let's see how the sound is, and we'll go from there. Here we go.
Now let's discuss 7-4-3, 2 hearts. This is one of the boards that is especially good for the pre-flop caller when they're out of position. That said, again, this is a spot where we have to presume the opponent, under the gun +1, is only betting with a very polarized range. So if they're betting with a polarized range, we in turn cannot attack it too hard. However, if they're betting way, way wider, if they're betting any 2 cards here, then we should be check raising a lot. Even in this scenario, though, notice I do opt to check raise a pretty good amount of the time. I'm check raising basically as many draws as I can possibly find. And I think this is reasonable. Perhaps some of these draws on check raising should be folds. I mean, we'll investigate this together. Like maybe King 6 is just a fold. Maybe Queen 6 here is marginal made hands just a fold. Queen 5 marginal made hands just a fold. That said, this is a board where when the opponent does bet the flop, I think they're going to end up checking the turn a lot of the time if they're playing reasonably, because if you look at this range, we have pretty good board coverage on a lot of turns. We have lots of ace highs, various king highs, queen highs, etc. that are calling, so the opponent can't just blindly barrel on a lot of turns. We also have lots of just very good hands, like top pairs, over pairs, etc. Notice I am check raising 10s in this scenario. I think this is fine. I think calling 10s is fine too. If we're calling 10s, we should probably call a few of the weaker draws. But notice, in this scenario, it looks like I'm probably just trying to find draws to check raise with, because otherwise I have to fold them. And if you look at all these draws, they all have some equity. It's not like they're in terrible shape. This may be a spot where solver actually check raises 7-6 and 7-5. Like, I would not be shocked if we look at this and we see these hands check raise a lot.
It's funny, that's some of my combinations that I like to check raise here is the gut shot pair. Top pair might be a little bit tighter than I do, but like 4-5, 3-5, 7-6, 5-6, or 4-6, 3-6. Even on some occasions, 8-5s, you know, with the overcard and the gut shot, depending on if I'm suited in the spades. But if I have like 7 of spades, 6 of hearts, or 5 of hearts, I'm probably check raising this board 90-ish%. No, probably like 70-75%, depending on the opponent and the stage of the tournament. At 40 big blinds, if we're near the beginning, I'm doing it 100% of the time because I've taken some kind of beat. Everybody's got an average of 70, 80 plus blinds. And this is the kind of scenario where you don't mind if you get jammed on because of your backdoor equity and ways to outdraw hands. Deeper in tournaments, this is a good move to pull on the button or on the bubble when you get opened like by the low jack or something. But under the gun +1 on the bubble, it's kind of sketchier. It's a good one to do on the final table, I'll tell you that. Yeah, so interesting.
Just because we've seen that previous example in previous GTO solutions, right? And as you study these spots, you'll see these same scenarios over and over. So anyway, I realize we're breaking the rule of having a few too many draws in this scenario just by a little bit, but I think that's probably fine. Given all the draws I have are certainly viable. Notice I'm check calling with a lot of flush draws too. Some of them, not all of them. Opting to check raise the good draws with overcards, as well as the backdoor draws with overcards. That way when we do check raise, the opponent doesn't know if we have flush draws, backdoor flush draws, or nut hands, and that's going to put them in a pretty bad spot. So I have a lot of draws, so I'm kind of looking to find more premium hands. And the question is, like, how wide do we go with premium hands? Do I raise 9s and 8s as well? It gets kind of dicey against under the gun +1. So anyway, I think this is pretty nice. Here I'm calling when I have a backdoor heart, of course, with the kings, king high hands. So we were raising, call it 20, 48, 32. So here, 20, 50, 30. So pretty close in terms of what the solver does. So that's nice. Notice solver does opt to check raise some overpairs, which is good. Look at this. Remember I said 7-6 and 7-5 probably check raise? Turns out they do, right? So that's perhaps a way to get a little bit more hands in the check raise value range. 8-6 for a gut shot. Bluffs. Let's see if yeah, so I check raise 8-6 for a gut shot, which is good. Really, 5s and 6s are check raising sporadically, so that's logical, obvious, right?
Plus things like the gut shot with the suited cards. 8-5 suited, 6 deuce suited, pairs and flush draws, 7 deuce suited, jack 5 suited. Those are all good check raises, obviously.
6-2 check raises, which is fine, makes sense. I don't know if I check raise 6-2. So I actually just folded 6-2. Probably thought it was a little bit too weak. Certainly seems too weak, but whatever. Solver still raises it or calls it, so that's interesting. Remember, the solver folds a touch less than I do. Maybe that's where that comes from. Solver check calls bad flush draws. I was raising them sometimes and calling them sometimes. Again, something that I found is just way more implementable than what the solver often does is I just check raise a lot of the weaker draws in terms of draws that lack showdown value. And I call with more draws that have a little bit of showdown value. And that's because, at least in my experience in the real world, people don't triple barrel often enough. So whenever you check call a hand like ace-2 here, that allows you to just easily get to the showdown. Where solver check raises ace-2. And ace-2 wins sometimes as a showdown. You don't necessarily need to blast your money in. So, interesting stuff. Notice solver check raises 7-2 sometimes, which is kind of bizarre. Don't really understand why. Maybe it's check raising 7-2 of spades, I imagine, which is weird. Anyway, solver does some weird stuff. But you see king-queen with hearts calls, right? Because you can tell it calls half the time. Looks like it folds the jack and the 10 of hearts sometimes. But king of hearts looks like that sticks around most of the time, and so does ace of hearts. So if you have the ace of hearts here, you just really can't be folding. If you have the king of hearts, you really can't be folding. And notice we don't fold, so good. Let's look at these. It looks like I folded ace-9 and ace-8. Let's see what it does with ace-9 and ace-8. Looks like it does fold them as well if they don't have the backdoor draw, so that's good. Lines up nicely. All right, good. Button raises, you call the big blind, 7-4-3. Now we have a weaker range, but so does the button. Again, let's just try to categorize here. We have a decent amount of premium made hands. I probably could use additional draws in this scenario, but take a look at the junk that I'm folding. Do any of these hands make sense as draws? That's what you always want to ask yourself, right? Like, try to naturally categorize your hands. And 9-8, I mean, I guess counts as a draw, but like not really. I mean, of course, with a heart it does, but maybe I need to be check raising more backdoor spades here. I can certainly see that as viable. I'm opting to just fold them. Yeah, I should probably check raise a few backdoor spades here. So yeah, that was probably a little bit too weak by me. Because in this scenario we have too many draws and a little bit, probably too much junk if I had to guess. So given we have too many draws, too much junk, we want to take some junk and add it to our draws given we can have some more draws. So what is the junk that wants to raise? It's probably these backdoor draws that check fold. So I don't know. Let's see what the solver does. Let's do a jack 10 backdoor draw. So it looks like it actually calls jack 10 backdoor draw, which is interesting. Solver raises almost none here. 8%. That's not very much. I was raising... Wait, what's happening here?
You're on the wrong one.
Oh, I'm looking at the wrong image. Ha! Okay, like what in the world's happening? Okay, so what was I saying? All right, I raised 13%. Solver only raises 9%, so a little bit less. Calls a ton, folds 40%, which a little bit more than I'm doing, so... Or a little bit less than I'm doing, so solver folds a bit more than me here. It is check raising, just its best 7s and better. Notice again, 7-6 and 7-5 don't mind check raising, so that's a corner case we should definitely take note of. Check raising some 6s. Calling a lot, right? Calling some weaker flush draws, which is neat. Always good to see. So yeah, looks nice, right? Notice like random fives call sometimes, queen five call sometimes, jack five call sometimes. I don't know if I was calling that wide. Looks like I was folding out the ones without the backdoor draw and raising them otherwise. But again, all the ratios line up, so that's nice and good. All right, under the gun +1 raises, we call from the button 7-4-3. 2 hearts. At this point, when the opponent bets small, well, you know what? This is actually, that's going to be that very similar scenario to the previous example where it was 9-7-5, where we probably don't have much of a raising range at all because neither player really has a huge range or nut advantage. And when the opponent bets small, it kind of implies they're betting at least kind of wide. So I don't think we need to be raising too often in this spot. And as you can see, I wrote down here, call, or call, fold. Because when we're facing that small bet, we do need to stick around very, very wide. Looks like I'm folding 17%. That's just going to be overcards without backdoor draws. Besides 10-8 and 9-8, which makes sense because they have backdoor equity and we elect to raise those anyway. Raising the 6s, which makes sense. Calling the 8s, which makes sense because 8s are usually better than the 6.
So this is a little leak that I have, is that under the gun +1 opens and then bets 1/3 pot, and I'm on the button with 40 big blinds. In these scenarios, I seem to find a lot more raises on these flops, I think. Like, I'm finding... I mean, even with blocker hands, I mean, you know, king, queen of spades here. I'm finding some raises with that. You know, the 8-6 suited, I'm finding some raises there. You know, a lot of the 7s that I continued with, I'm finding raises with, and maybe that's wrong, or maybe it's just different playing at the stakes I'm playing. Because to be fair, while all this applies to all levels, certain, you know, playing at the lower levels, you can do things that don't work at the higher levels. So my average buy-in in tournaments being $8 to $10. I mean, we're talking about players who know to raise certain hands, know to c-bet certain hands, and know that they're going to be c-betting quite often, so they're c-betting 1/3 of the time. But see, this is a low-frequency board for the under-the-gun one's range, meaning that there are not a lot of times where his hand is improved by this board, so his bets should be, like the last example, 2/3 pot, which give us a clear kind of definitive thing going on. When he's betting small here, it's kind of just an automatic kind of thing, and he shouldn't be betting this board this way. This is a mistake. When under the gun one bets 1/3 pot here into the button heads up, he should be betting bigger or checking, I think, a lot. Betting 1/3 pot, I think, is a mistake because, one, we get incentivized to call with all these, you know, reasonable hands that we're going to have, but also it kind of just says I don't have an overpair because I'm not protecting. You know what I'm saying? Like, even if you had aces with the ace of hearts, you would bet more here because this is a super wet board. Maybe that's the disparity I'm seeing in the different buy-ins, because I will say at, you know, $100 buy-ins, you're seeing the 1/3 pot bet pretty much every time, unless, you know, it's multi-way. So for me, there's a lot of raises in here and not a lot of calls. Well, there's a lot of calls, but I think half of these turn into raises, like 8-6 suited, you know, the 5-4 suited, the pocket 10s, you know, even pocket 9s, really 9-8 for sure suited, and in just spades suited, backdoor suited is fine too. Pretty much any pair that I end up with a gut shot, 5-4, you know, 6-4, you know, 3-6 if I got there with it somehow. Yeah, and I think even stuff like the king 6 suited, you know, can definitely be a raise in a scenario with 40 big blinds, because, you know, if I have a gut shot and a flush draw, there's 12 cards that come off that are good for me. Plus, the king is good sometimes too when I'm up against queens, if the queens jam. So I can have as many as 15 outs here, you know, which is 60%. So it's basically an equity smash. So I think raising that one right on the flop works great for me. That being said, we are talking about in this course general GTO, so it's just something that to note that the stakes you're playing at or the rooms you're playing at, like WSOP plays much different than ACR, plays much different than PokerStars. There are little adjustments versus population generally, but I think we can look at this as a standard as to what to do in these situations. So just a side note.
So I think all this looks pretty nice. Actually, we have miscategorization here. I apologize. I'm raising 8-6 as a bluff, as a draw, right? So we have a few more draws than premium made hands as it appears. But that said, it doesn't really matter because I already know I'm calling in this scenario very, very frequently. And I can already tell you the solver's not going to raise a lot. So yeah, solver raises only 8%, which is very little. When solver does raise, looks like it's over pairs, random queen jack sets, tiny sliver of straights, top pair gut.
All right, I'm much closer to the solver than I am to Jonathan Little's implementable range, which isn't good, but it means I'm on the right track. Because playing, 500 plus player tournaments, you kind of have to have a read on population, and I think the closer you get to the solver in the early and mid stages is probably best. But versus population and how implementable strategies work against actual players, I'd rather get closer to Jonathan Little's style when we get down to like the money. You know what I mean? Like, so more player specific.
Shot again. So, nothing really to see here. This is a spot where you should fold very infrequently. I was folding 17%, solver folded 16%, so same thing. And it's very important to note, a big takeaway here is when you're facing a small bet in position, you just can't fold. You cannot fold. When you're facing even a medium or a big bet in position and your range is reasonable, as it should be, right? You just can't fold. So given you just cannot fold in these scenarios, you should do a ton of calling. Whereas when you are out of position, you should do substantially more folding and or check raising. All right, good. You made it through all the examples for this section. Let's keep moving forward.
All right. So when you're in the big blind facing a bet on this board, you will raise more often against 33 or 67% from a player in position. Well, I believe you're raising more versus the bigger bet, correct? No. Smaller bet, you should check raise more often. So he didn't give that example, and that makes sense because the smaller bet is more automatic, like I was saying. Yeah, because that denotes a pair. What am I thinking? Okay, fine. You're in the big blind facing a bet from the button on this board. What should you do with ace-7 off? I mean, it seems like that's a premium scenario hand. It's, I should just look it up. I'm guessing it's a call by the solver, but I like a check raise, honestly. Yeah. Premium hand you should raise on the flop. Right, because we're getting value and protecting, so it's kind of a 2-for-1. You're in the big blind facing a small bet from under the gun +1. What should you do with ace-7 off in that scenario? Well, it's still a raise, right? No. Against a tight range, should be considered a marginal made hand to call. Okay, so by the position, because the under the gun +1 range is stronger, then we change the rules. Okay, it also didn't give me the bet sizing, but whatever. Okay, so I'm not good with word problems. I'm better seeing the hand. Let's go on to the next section. There's 3 more sections to this. I want to finish it up today. Hopefully, my in-laws don't get here too early. So as the pre-flop raiser out of position when facing a bet. So you raised in under the gun +1 or under the gun, and somebody called in the big blind, and then they led into you on the flop. I'm seeing this a lot on WSOP in the cash games, and I'm really interested in this.
Now let's discuss as the pre-flop raiser out of position when you are facing a bet. So how does this happen? This is when you raise, let's say from under the gun +1, the button calls, everybody else folds,
right.
Flop comes, and you elect to check. Let's take a second and pause and think about the hands we're checking here. Remember, from out of position, we are going to want to bet some portion of the time and check some portion of the time in essentially every scenario. We are not going to want to continuation bet 100% of the time.
So for me, these are the scenarios where I raised ace king or ace queen, something like that. Got called, another cutoff. Flop came off, 9-4 deuce. Maybe I have a backdoor flush draw, something like that. Or even could just have a straight up flush draw. Could have flop 2 of my suit, especially in cash games, but we're talking about tournaments here. I like checking a lot in that scenario because I have good showdown value. I have overcards. I have a good draw, and I don't want to get blown off it. Like if I c-bet and the player just bombs it, the pot becomes too unmanageable. But if I check, even a player with a set will not bet that big. You know what I'm saying? Even if they see the flush draw, because there's no reason for them to believe that I have the flush draw yet. So they're going to bet, 2/3 pot, and then it becomes manageable to call. For me, that's this scenario 90% of the time.
All that often. Because the player on the button's usually calling with a reasonable range. Since they're calling with a reasonable range, we are usually not going to have the range or the nut advantage. Therefore, we need to check. If you think back to how the solver plays a lot of situations like this, it's very often using a very mixed strategy where it is betting some portion of the time and checking some portion of the time with every single hand in your range, and it becomes kind of convoluted. We did our best, though, to use the 4 categories, premium made hands, draws, marginal made hands, and junk, to break down our range, bet our premium made hands and draws, check our marginal made hands and junk. But if you remember back to all these scenarios, I always recommended checking with some nut hands. And that's going to come in to play here because when we face a bet, what is our opponent likely betting with? We check the flop, what are they betting with? Well, they are betting with their premium made hands and draws. They should be betting very, very polarized. If your opponents don't use this strategy, then you're going to need to adjust accordingly. But if your opponent's playing well, they're going to be betting very polarized in this scenario with their premium made hands and draws. Fine. Say they bet their premium made hands and draws. Should we be doing a lot of raising? Well, usually not, right? Because we have what's referred to as a condensed range. That's when we have a range containing a lot of medium strength hands, and our opponent's range is polarized, meaning they have the nuts or they have draws, right? And against that range, you don't want to do a ton of raising. So we're going to end up check calling a lot, and having some nut hands in your range is going to really, really help with that, because now we'll be able to very easily check call the flop, the turn, and the river against even aggressive opponents, and we're not going to be overfolding too often in this situation. So make sure you are checking some nut hands out of position. It's very important. Often this will come in the form of like super nut hands, like top set, middle set, maybe overpairs like aces and kings, maybe hands like flushes and straights if you have them. But we already discussed that previously for how you should play when you are out of position as the pre-flop raiser. Okay, when you're facing a bet, you usually, well, pretty much always, want to reference the bet response flow chart. So let's take a look at it. With our junk, we just fold. Sometimes you're going to have junk. Whenever you raise ace-4 of diamonds and the flop comes queen-jack-9, no diamond. That's just junk. You check it, your opponent bets, you fold. Move on, nothing to see here. With our marginal made hands, like ace-jack on queen-jack-9, you're going to be check calling, right? Marginal made hands are usually top pair, middle pair, bottom pair, sometimes ace-high, sometimes like king-high with backdoor draws, but we'll discuss that in the examples going forward. And then with our premium made hands or draws, you always want to ask, do we have the nut advantage? Okay. Usually, in this scenario, you will not. Again, because the opponent's betting with a polarized range, we are checking with a mostly condensed range. Therefore, we are usually not going to have the range advantage, which leads to a whole lot of check calling out of position.
Nut advantage.
However, as we are checking with a wider and wider range from out of position, usually that's when we don't have the range advantage at all, you're going to find that sometimes we do have some hands in our range that are the effective nuts. That's usually going to be stuff like top set, overpairs, flushes, etc. And sometimes in that scenario, we are going to want to raise if we have an adequate number of draws. And this,
like a good example of the effective nuts, and I go back to this a lot because people forget about the effective nuts. Let's say you're under the gun +1 and you opened pocket sixes. You know, the very bottom of the pairs that you're going to open, right? And then you get called in the cutoff, and the flop comes down 6, 6 deuce ace, or 6 deuce tray, let's say. So 4-5 is the nuts. but you have the effective nuts. You know what I mean? Like, you have a hand that is strong enough that if you went broke, everybody would understand. So check raising in those scenarios, or you know, check calling to trap, like, it's going to be a rare coincidence that your opponent is going to have 5-4 immediately. And when a 4 or a 5 comes off, you can kind of figure out, you know, did they start with ace-4 or ace-5 and they've made the, you know, the gut shot or whatever like that. But the effective nuts is a concept that once I started understanding what it meant, I started doing much better and winning more tournaments, because it kept me from folding super strong hands that just weren't enough to feel 100% confident. But after a while, you feel as confident as your hand is. You go, well, this hand wins about 98% of the time, so let's get the money in. You know what I mean? Shit like that. And occasionally you're going to be wrong, but very rarely. And it's just a coincidence.
This is where it's very important that you spend time away from the table studying your range, your opponent's range, etc., to make sure you understand proper range analysis. This is very important. And we're going to be going through all the common spots in just a second. Also, worth mentioning, as you get shallower stacked, you should call a little bit wider, because you're going to realize your equity a little bit better. Meaning, if you have just like middle pair, you know not to fold middle pair when you have 15 big blinds or something like that. And if you are going to raise, you typically want to raise to a smaller size, unless you're very close to being all in. And when you're deeper stacked, you want to call tighter, because you're going to realize your equity worse. And when you are going to raise, you want to raise larger. Okay? Let's take a look at some examples, and this situation will become much more clear.
Those situations for the deep stack, calling tighter and raising larger, you're calling tighter because you're not going to see the whole board and realize your equity often enough because of the size of the stacks, but you want to raise larger because you want to reduce the stack to pot ratio so you can realize that equity and get all the money in when you want to. Short stack calling wider because you don't have as much to lose, and because there is so much more to gain, and you will realize your equity, meaning you will get all of your money in the pot with the best hand a grand majority of the time when you're at 15 big blinds versus when you're at 100 big blinds. And raising smaller because, again, you don't need to reduce the stack to pot ratio that much. It's pretty easy to get it in. When you start a hand with 25 big blinds and you end up with top pair, top kicker, it's pretty easy to get the money in if you get any kind of action. You know, somebody c-bets and you raise, you don't even have to 3x it. You can 2x it or 2.5x it. And, you know, somebody's, you know, betting 2 big blinds and you make it 5. Well, if they call, well, now there's 10, 12, 13, 14 in the pot, and, you know, you have 22 left behind. Any kind of reasonable bet on the turn that you make that gets called is going to lead to you getting it all in at a less than 1-to-1 stack to pot ratio on the river. So that's why those considerations are there. So let's look at the quiz. You're out of position as a pre-flop raiser. What type of hand should you check raise? Select all that apply. I'm going to go with premium made hands and draws. Yeah. So just the ones that you want to get the money in, and the ones that you don't mind getting the money in. The good draws and the premium made hands, you know, pretty explanatory, self-explanatory. Out of position as pre-flop raiser, you should check more on high card boards or low card boards. I'm going to say you're going to check more on low card boards because your range, earlier in position that you are, you're going to have more high cards. So I guess your premium made hands would contain high cards. That's interesting. Low card boards. So I guess low card boards, right? Yeah. Because you should check at a higher frequency of these boards due to the lack of a range advantage, right? Because the range that's helped by this board is not in your hand because you're in an earlier position than your opponent. Out of position as a pre-flop raiser, should you check raise more on high card boards or low card boards? Well, it's probably high card boards. No, low card boards, because you check more on these boards, it leads you to, oh, okay. So because it's a low card board, we are then checking more, and that leads to you having more premium hands and draws in your check raise range. Okay, that makes more sense because we're not checking the high card board very much. So therefore, we are checking the low card board very much, which means we're going to have more check raises in there because we're not rarely going to check raise a high card board because that fits our range. Okay. Didn't read the question fully. Word problems are hard for me, man. It's much easier for me to show me a board and like say, what do you do here? And I go, oh, well, we're going to check raise this situation more than that situation. And I get it right, but, you know, dyslexia.
Now let's take a look at some examples when you're the pre-flop raiser, out of position.
This is a long section. We might not get through this, but we're going to try.
you check and you face a bet. So you're under the gun +1. Button calls, flop comes ace, jack, 5, 2 spades. You check, button bets 2/3 pot. Okay, this is a situation where if you look at our range to check the flop, our range is very condensed. A condensed range is a range that has lots of medium strength hands but lacks premium hands and junky hands. Now, we do have some junky hands in this scenario, but we have a lot of marginal made hands, right? All these aces are very clearly pretty good, but marginal. Pocket kings, queens, all these jacks, pocket 10s, 9s, even 8s and 7s and 6s are decent. So this is a spot where we have a condensed range, but if you think about the range our opponent should be betting this flop with, go back and reference that portion of this course if you forgot, they should be betting very, very polarized, meaning they have either a very, very good hand or a draw. And against a very good hand or draw, we in turn only want to be raising with our very good hands and draws. But if you look at this range, we actually don't have any very good hands. So we should not have a raising range in this scenario. So the strategy here is to call at the minimum defense frequency or more, if at all possible. And in this scenario, minimum defense frequency is 40%. Make sure you go back to the introduction section if you don't know how to find minimum defense frequency. I'll show you real quick. We would take, let's see, we would take 1 minus the bet, which is 0.67, divided by the bet plus the pot, which is 1.67. And then we do -1. So we need to defend with at least 60% of our range here, right? And notice in this scenario, I'm defending 70% of our range, right? 69%. So we're defending it more than minimum defense frequency. In this scenario, it's probably fine to fold out a few more hands. If I had to pick hands to fold, it would probably be, well, the weakest hands in the range that I'm continuing with, which would be 10s and 9s. Maybe 10s and 9s with a spade stick around, whereas 10s and 9s without a spade don't stick around. I think that would be fine. Maybe 8s and 7s and 6s with a spade stick around. I would have no problem with that. Turns out, backdoor draws are relevant. So the strategy in this spot, we'll go ahead and talk about flop, turn, and river strategy just a little bit when we're in this scenario, is to check call the flop about 70% of the time. And then on the turn, we're going to check call the turn about 70% of the time, and we're going to check call the river about 70% of the time, defending wider as we're facing a smaller bet than 2/3 pot, and defending more when we are, defending wider when we're facing a smaller bet, defending less when we're facing a bigger bet. And what that's generally going to result in is us folding out the unpaired hands and weakest underpairs on the flop, folding out the pocket kings, queens, and the weakest jacks on the turn, 10s and 9s, and then we're going to fold out all the jacks on the river. And that's going to result in us check calling down with all these ace-X, and by the river, check folding out everything else. And you may say, we're going to fold out a lot by the river, aren't we? But it turns out that is roughly the GTO strategy. Defend at the minimum defense frequency or a little bit more, and you'll usually just be fine. And that is our strategy in this scenario. You may look at this and say, well, what if your opponent has a really good hand, like a set? Don't they just get paid off every time? And the answer is yes. They do get paid off every time I call down. They win every single time. But understand that the opponent's range contains much more than just sets when they're betting. They're also going to have draws like Queen 10 and King 10 and flush draws, right? And whenever they have those and they're barreling off and I'm sitting here with an ace and I just don't fold it, they're going to end up bluffing off into my hands that aren't folding. So this strategy mitigates the fact that the opponent is going to potentially be aggressive. Now, of course, if you're playing against an opponent who never bluffs, maybe you should be overfolding by the river, right? That said, what a lot of people do very wrong in this spot is they check a hand like ace-9, check call the flop, check call the turn, and then check fold the river, and that results in them folding out pretty much their entire range unless they make two pair, which, will happen sometimes, but not all that often. And if you fold out literally every hand by the river, clearly you're playing quite poorly, right? Because all your opponent has to do is bet and they just crush you. So anyway, this is what I'm doing in this scenario. We could fold out a few more hands. I think that's perfectly viable given our opponent's 2/3 bet size. But notice we're not raising because we have a condensed range and our opponent has a polarized range. Even if I was doing what the solver does, where it mixes its checks and bets with every hand in the range, I would still not have very many obvious bluffs in this scenario. And given we don't have very many obvious bluffs, we really should not be doing too much raising. So let's see what the solver does. When I say bluffs, I mean draws, right? Notice here, solver raises basically never. It does fold closer to minimum defense frequency of 40%. It folds a little bit more than I do. Notice it is picking these 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s with a spade to continue, and it folds when they don't have a spade, so you should probably be doing that. Notice it's just calling with everything that it has besides the unpaired hands, right? And that makes sense. It's a logical strategy. And the great thing is, if you balance your checking range on the flop, your marginal made hand to junk range to be about 70% marginal made hands that are check calling, 30% junk that is check folding, this is usually what happens, and you're going to be playing fine. You're going to be nice and unexploitable, which is the goal. Okay? I do want to make a point before we move forward that notice the solver is... Like, take a look at this ace-3 of spades, right? Or ace-3 suited. It has this hand about 50% of the time. That's because it bets it about 50% of the time on the flop, which means it's no longer in the range. The way we are playing over here, we are using non-mixed strategies, where I'm always checking the ace-3 suited, right? So I have this hand 100%. This strategy is way easier to implement, but it's going to result in sometimes me not having hands that the GTO solver has on the turn and the river, because I will have played those hands differently previously. And again, this is going to result in you not playing the perfect GTO strategy, and the strategy the solver gives may not actually be accurate for the way my range is laid out on specific turns and rivers. So sometimes the solver is going to be raising a little bit more than I do, sometimes a little bit less, and that's okay, because we're still playing a roughly balanced strategy. We just want to make sure our folding percentage is roughly what the solver's is, and that's going to result in us playing at least well enough. Again, not the perfect GTO strategy, but a good, strong, implementable strategy that's going to make you better than basically everyone you play against. All right, let's take a look at King, King, 6. Well, in King, King, 6, if you think back to what we were doing, we were betting this flop something like, if my memory is working right, something like 90% of the time. And I said, for all practical purposes, just bet everything. Anytime the solver's checking only 15 or 20% of the time or less, you're probably perfectly fine just continuation betting everything. However, I want to show you what the solver would do if it had checked the flop. And again, this is a scenario where, take a look, all these cells are 100%. I actually made these much bigger. I filled the full cell with what the solver would do, because if I didn't do that, they would all look like pocket 5s here. You see this pocket 5s that's betting a tiny sliver of the time? They would all basically be empty cells, because the solver bets almost all the time in this scenario. So this solution is not all that relevant, but I do want to show that in this scenario, solver has a big nut advantage. Even when it does check, it has lots of king X, and it is check raising the king X, and then a smattering of draws. So when you do have a check raising range in these scenarios, it usually will be with the super nut hands that you opted to check, and a smattering of draws that have some backdoor equity. All right, let's say we raise under the gun +1 and the button calls. Flop comes queen, 10, 5, all spades. This was an interesting scenario that we spent a decent amount of time on earlier, and I made a point to say that you really, really, really want to check with some nut flushes here. We bet lots of the lower flushes, but we are checking a lot of the nut flushes. So this is a spot where we want to ask, first, do we have any logical draws that can balance out our check raises if we want to have any check raises here? And if you look at our range, there are really no draws here, unless you're going to look really hard for them. I mean, I guess you could find like pocket 9s, pocket 8s, pocket 7s, pocket 6s with a spade. I guess that's a draw. But in reality, they're not very good draws at all. And I don't actually think we need to raise our flushes here. I think check calling is quite nice in the scenario, because it forces the opponent to stay in the pot with a lot of hands that are drawing thin to dead. So I really, really like check calling with a lot of the flushes here. I mean, I suppose if you wanted to raise, you could raise these lower flushes, because they're kind of susceptible to being outdrawn. I suppose you could raise like pocket aces and ace 10 if they have a spade, but those are just really good marginal made hands, right? And then you could raise these bluffs down here, but I just don't think that's necessary at all. Notice here in this scenario, minimum defense frequency actually is 25%. 0.33 divided by 1.33 is 25%. I'm sorry, so minimum defense frequency is 75%, because we can fold out 25%. I'm actually overfolding just a little bit. I'm trying to find hands I would even like to continue with. It's kind of hard to find any, right? I don't even know. Which hands am I folding that I'd like to continue with? Notice here, by the way, I want to make this clear. I guess I didn't make this clear here. I have 36 junk hands. The junk hands are pocket 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s without a spade. And also all of these hands up here. Low ace X suited.
There we go. And connected successful. Hey, nice. All right. Let's go back down. We're on this section. See if we can pick it up. I'm going to backtrack it just a little bit. Just because I was kind of distracted. So we'll go back to 10 minutes flat.
Now let's take a look at some examples suited without a
There we go.
flush. So like king 8 of diamonds. So I mean, I guess in theory I could call like ace, a king 9 of diamonds, but calling king 9 of diamonds seems pretty optimistic. I was betting, by the way, with king jack of hearts on the flop and jack 9 of hearts on the flop, so I don't have those in my range. If you have any questions about what my range looked like previously, just go back to the section where I raise under the gun +1 and I'm first to act. That will show you the strategy I'm using. So I really am having a tough time finding very many hands I would even want to continue with if I wanted to continue a little bit wider. And sometimes that's going to happen. Sometimes the board just doesn't line up great for you, and you should slightly overfold against the minimum defense frequency. That said, you should usually strive to defend at somewhat close to the minimum defense frequency when you are playing a condensed range. Solver actually does that. You see Solver sticks around 24% or folds 26% of the time, just a touch more the minimum defense frequency. Notice Solver basically never raises, again, due to a complete lack of draws in this spot. What's it calling with that I'm not? So Solver actually calls some king 9s more than 25% of the time here, right? Which implies to me that it's calling stuff like king 9 of diamonds. Seems pretty optimistic to me. If it has ace, notice here Solver has ace jack in its range, whereas I bet it every time on the flop. Ace jack would be a very, very clear check call, right? Because it has gut shot and overcard. So again, this is where sometimes our strategy is not going to line up perfectly with the Solver, because we bet our ace kings and ace jacks on the flop where Solver check them. And if you do check ace king and ace jack, then obviously you're not going to fold them against a small bet, right? And that's what I was saying earlier about how when the Solver uses mixed strategies, sometimes their numbers are going to line up a little bit different than ours. All right, let's take a look at jack 6-2. We check, opponent bets small again. When you're facing these small bets, I want to make it really clear, you just cannot substantially overfold. What a lot of people do wrong is they just fold out everything unless it's a pair, and that would be a pretty big mistake. Like right here, we just have to call with some ace highs. In this scenario, we were actually betting the flop a pretty good chunk of the time, with like all backdoor flush draws, lots of various overcard type hands like king queen, lots of various backdoor draws like I already mentioned. So anyway, we're betting the flop a pretty good chunk of the time here. So we're really not checking it a lot to begin with. But when we do check, we need to proceed intelligently. Notice I don't really have any nut hands, and besides pocket jacks. And if I would like to raise pocket jacks, I have to find some bluffs, but notice that's only 3 combinations of hands, which is, you know, almost none of our range. So therefore, I really don't want to be raising this spot all that often. Although I can go ahead and tell you, this is a spot where the Solver will definitely mix and check aces, kings, and queens sometimes. And in scenarios like this where you have strong overpairs that are still vulnerable to being outdrawn, 40 big blinds deep, you should look to check raise those some portion of the time. And I imagine the Solver is going to be check raising this spot more than I am, which is 0%, because it's going to have strong but still vulnerable hands. Like it's going to have ace jack sometimes probably too, and aces, kings, and queens. And those hands really want to check raise. And it's also going to have sporadic backdoor draws that I don't have because I bet them pretty much all on the flop. Anyway, folding.
This is that thing that I'll end up doing when I raise and hit just the perfect flop for me, where it's like, you know, this jack 6 deuce if I'm under the gun +1 and raising and at 40 big blinds deep, and I have the ace jack versus a, you know, loose, player. This is one of those ones where I don't see much reason of betting because we're not going to get paid at all, you know what I'm saying? So we're only protecting our hand against hands that we absolutely crush. So for me, check raising there in those scenarios is pretty brilliant results-wise, just because you'll check, the player will see it as weakness, they'll bet, and then you can raise. And you do get that E-call that I talk about a lot where people are like, well, I'm going to call with something, but try to find the draw in here. Like, what's the draw? You know what I'm saying? That the button has. Like, the button has a draw at a 2 pair. Like, maybe they have, you know, like a suited ace 6 or ace deuce, or they have like a king jack or queen jack or 10 jack very commonly. You know what I'm saying? Check raising hands like this, and then when the turn comes off, you know, blank, and betting reasonably, like 2/3 pot, but now you're pretty much pot committed, you're going to see a lot of players just jam the 10 jack and king jack against you. especially when the turn brings off like another club or diamond or something like that. It's just kind of going to confuse people, and I've had it happen live where I've done that, and the person got all the money in on the turn with me, and they go, I got a jack, and I go, me too, and I show them the ace jack, and they roll over the jack queen or something, and I've gotten chastised for it. They're like, you didn't protect your hand, and it's one of those things where I don't really need to. You know what I'm saying? So I'll throw in the check raises with those premium hands, kind of close to solverish, but then again, I'm not playing against the most sophisticated players at these buy-in levels. So just a little side note is another thing where my strategy ends up closer to the solver than the better implementable strategy overall. Implementable strategy overall would lead the ace jack because it would be afraid there would be no bet coming, you know. But you know, there's a lot of situations where I think you can check it to try to get paid.
26%, which is minimum defense frequency, so that's good. Solver actually overfolds here a little bit, up to 31%. And you see Solver raises 20% of the time. So this is a big difference than what I was doing. But again, take a look at the hands the Solver opts to raise. They want to raise their aces, kings, and queens, and ace-jack when they have them, which makes a whole lot of sense. The thing is, though, I don't have them. Obviously, the Solver bets these the majority of the time on the flop, but like 15% or 20% of the time it has aces, and 5% of the time it has kings, and it wants to raise in those small instances where it does have those hands. So if you do decide to mix it up,
the solver is mixing it up, but it's not so much for those purposes. It's because you're at 40 big blinds. Now you're going to see a lot more checking on the flop when you're in the solver at 20 and 25 big blinds when you have the aces under the gun +1 and you're heads up against one opponent. And I think we can all see why that reason is. The solver's main goal, though, is to get in as much money as possible when we're in the strongest positions equity-wise. And with aces, we're pretty damn good on this scenario. We're pretty much 80% unless a set has been flopped against us. So in a scenario where the move is to get 80%, or is to get the money in and be good 80% of the time, the solver's electing to check to get more in. The solver's not taking into account the fact of times when we check and get checked behind because players may think something is up. But then again, I do think this is one of those premium cases because really we can only be up against other pairs and the occasional set. And when we have aces at 40 big blinds and somebody made a set, well, we're just going to probably go broke. But there are some times when checking allows us to not go broke just because of the player's reaction. Like a lot of times, if you check raise this flop, somebody with pocket jacks will not just get the money in. They'll sit there and call your check raise, and the turn comes off a queen or a king, and then if you take a few seconds and check, you're going to see them check back, and then you check the river, and then they're going to bet, and you haven't gotten your whole stack in because maybe you don't feel like it's all a-okay, and then you know you're still at 20 big blinds, or they go absolutely banana crackers when the king comes off or something like that, when they were, you know, just betting with an over cards and, you know, stuff. So there are little things the solver does to get the most money in possible, not as frequently as possible. So I think that's where the disparity comes in. That being said, I'm going to default to Jonathan Little's implementable strategy because it's just too much to think about. And it's too inconsistent a move to implement 100% of the time. And when something you can't do the majority of the time, I kind of just let it go. So it's a very specific situation where I'm check raising the aces.
Or whatnot, and check these hands, you need to be check raising. Also, take a look at the bluffs the solver opts to use, which is pretty neat. It's using the ace-5, ace-4, ace-3. I have to imagine all these are backdoor draws. It's randomly check raising like pocket nines, which makes very little sense to me. It's check raising like queen 9 backdoor draw, which makes sense. Queen 10 backdoor draw makes sense. King 10 backdoor draw, again, makes sense. So this is a spot where the solver has more of these hands that really want to check raise, and therefore it opts to use other various hands that it uses in this mixed strategy to raise. That said, if you look at the range we opted to use here, we did not slow play aces, kings, and queens, because really, you see, solver almost never has these hands anyway, either, but it does every once in a while. But we don't have these in our range, therefore we don't have these hands we want to raise, therefore we don't need to raise, right? And that's okay. All right, let's take a look at this spot. You raise
Okay. I'll try to wrap it up quick.
Under the gun +1, button calls, it comes Jack 6-6. This is another spot where we have no premium made hands besides It's pocket jacks, maybe pocket sixes if we have it. We check opponent bets 33% pot. We again need to defend very frequently. This is a spot where we should be defending a ton. You see, I'm only actually folding 11% of the time here, which may be a little bit too little. I can probably fold a little bit more than this. But what hands do I really want to fold here? I mean, I guess I could fold out like ace 10, 9, 8, 7 without a backdoor draw, I guess. So maybe I could fold out the ace 10 offsuit. But like, what else do I even want to fold? I don't really want to fold any of these other hands. So this is a spot where I'm going to be defending very frequently. Again, the player on the button has some sixes, and I don't really have very many sixes. So I'm going to be check calling here a ton. Solver may have pocket aces, kings, queens again that does want to check raise, but as we played this, we do not. And you may say, well, shouldn't we start mixing this by like betting our aces and kings, but checking our queens, or checking our aces but betting our aces and kings and queens? And I think that's actually viable. The problem though is that, well, let's take a look at what Solver actually did here. Solver checked aces, kings, and queens like 10% of the time each. So only a third of the time, well, let's say 0.3 out of the total of 3. So Solver's only really checking here 10, 15, 20% of the time total, when they have overpairs, which is not often at all. The way I usually think about balancing these, if I wanted to make an implementable strategy, is take all the kings, put it in the aces. Take all the queens, put it in the aces. Does it make up one full cell worth of aces? And it wouldn't here, right? Like kings is almost nothing, queens is almost nothing. So really we have like half of our aces. So if we have 6 combinations of aces, if you wanted to play a more balanced strategy, you would check them half the time on the flop and bet them half the time on the flop. Always bet your kings, always bet your queens, instead of mixing these strategies. That said, it's just like overly advanced and completely not necessary in my opinion. That said, you see here Solver does check raise 16% of the time. We don't have any of those hands, so we don't check raise any in this scenario, and I think that's
one of those things where the solver gets way too convoluted and it's not implementable. That's why we are trying to find the implementable strategy, because no human computer exists that can pull that off.
Is okay. You do not always have to have a check raising range, especially when your opponent does have some sixes. Like notice here, Solver has a 6 every once in a while, right? When Solver does check raise bluff, it of course is check raise bluffing with the backdoor draws, which makes a whole lot of sense. And it's also check raising ace jack if it has it. All right, now we're gonna get to these scenarios where we were checking a ton on the flop, and
I'm going to back this up just a little to right there.
Backdoor draws, which makes a whole lot of sense. And it's also check raising ace jack if it has it.
Okay, I'm gonna pause here. We're going to call this part 1 of this section, and I'm going to go meet with my in-laws, and we're going to come back in a little bit and finish this up. It's only the rest of this and one more little section to go, and then we can finish up the pre-flop strategy when facing a bet. I want to finish that today, so I'll see you guys again in a little bit. I'll be right back. Just this up. Let me just bring this over here. Make sure this is working. And if this is screwing you up at all, just go over to the YouTube and there we go. And why is this not working? There we go. If this screws you up at all, just go over to the YouTube. I'm going to put both parts together and keep it cohesive from there. But let's just pick up where we left off, trying to finish this section today.
All right. Now we're going to get to these scenarios where we were checking a ton on the flop, and I was advocating checking a ton on the flop. This is a spot where now we actually will start having a check-raising strategy, okay? So this is a spot where we raise under the gun +1, button calls, it comes 9-7-5. If you think back to our range, we were checking a lot here. And when the opponent bets small, this indicates they're betting with more than just the absolute best hands, because if they were betting bigger, they'd be a little bit more polarized. If they were betting bigger, we would check raise less. But when they use a small size in a spot like this, where I know I am checking with some of my effective nut hands that are also very susceptible to being outdrawn, we should now start raising somewhat often with the hands that really want protection, which are going to be overpairs, top pairs, maybe even pairs plus draws. Like we were seeing earlier, where I was saying like top pair plus gut shot wants to be check raising. Now we're going to see, well, hands like pocket ace here I think is good enough to check raise for value/protection, because it's very vulnerable to being outdrawn and it's likely to be the best hand, and when it's not, it still has some outs. So let's take a look at this. Aces, kings, jack 9, 10, 9, 9, 8, I think are all viable check raises on this board. Most people don't check raise these hands on this board. They don't check raise anything ever. But I think this is a spot where you definitely want to be check raising these hands. Now we need to find some bluffs. Well, looking at this range, there are not a whole lot of obvious bluffs. Really, none. The most obvious bluff here is the king 8 of hearts that we randomly checked. If we had additional 8s, we'd probably want to check raise those. If we had additional 6s, we'd probably want to check raise those. But notice, I bet all of those on the flop, right? So what's our next best bluffs? Well, it's either going to be these aces with backdoor draws, or it's going to be just like random junky overcards. And I think either way you go here is perfectly viable. Either check raising the junky overcards or check raising backdoor flush draws. In reality, I think I would check raise probably maybe even more backdoor draws. I think we can get away with more bluffs, clearly. One thing I do want to point out here is as you're check raising with weaker hands for value, like pocket 8s and 10-9 here, that very easily could be beat, you can't check raise nearly as many draws. As you're check raising with a range that is very polarized, like the super nuts, like straights and sets, then you get to raise with more junky draws, a larger combination of draws, because you know your premium hands like never lose, right? Or basically never lose. Whereas here, if you look at all these hands I'm check raising, they actually do lose a decent amount of the time. And when that happens, you don't get to check raise bluff nearly as often. It's a very important point. I want to make it very, very clear here. So anyway, this is roughly what I'm doing. I'm check raising about 20%. Solver check raises even more, 33%. But again, Solver has better hands in their range to check raise. Notice I have like, well, very few 9s. The 9s I do have, I am check raising just like Solver does. Notice Solver check raises pocket 8s a decent amount as well, which is good to see. Like I said, if I had additional 6s, I would check raise those. Solver check raises 6s and 8s a ton when it has them. And then it's just like striving hard to find bluffs, right? So it's check raising all these king, queen jack, queen jack with backdoor draws most likely. Notice it has these hands in its range, whereas I don't. Yes, I don't think I do. Oh, no, I do. Oh, no, I don't, because I bet those all on the flop, so those aren't in the range. So I should have bluffed with some of these low ace-x suited. I know I didn't do it here. I didn't put it in this image, but I should have done this because I'm actually folding too often as well. Let's see how often Solver folds. Solver folds, well, 44%, so actually Solver folds a lot too. I think I should have taken some of these low ace-x suited backdoor draws and bluffed them. Notice Solver does just fold ace 10, ace jack, etc. So again, this is where Solver's range is a little bit different than ours to get here, so it's going to look different, but you see Solver is check raising here a pretty good chunk of the time, and that's important to take away. You know, if you wanted to play like the GTO Solver in this spot against a small flop bet, look at this. You're actually check raising way more often than you call, right? So you check raise 33%, check call 22%. That's something a lot of people don't do. They just check call a ton here, like 100%. And so far, I know I've actually advocated check calling a lot on the flop, but in scenarios like this where you know you're check raising some top pair or checking some top pairs and over pairs, you in turn want to check raise with them and your junky draws. Let's take a look at one more spot like this. This is a spot where we were checking very, very frequently. Flop comes 7-4-3. We check the flop. Opponent bets. Now we're going to want to check raise again our best made hands and our draws. Notice we don't actually have a ton of quote unquote best made hands here. Aces, kings.
It should be noted the thing that's not getting repeated is that this is versus a 33% pot bet. You're not going to be check raising the 2/3 pot bets on this because those are the more polarized bets, meaning it's either absolutely nothing, wherein a check raise doesn't do you any good because it's not going to go any further and you're going to kill your action, or the player actually has something that may beat you. So in those scenarios, just calling is good because it can keep a player who may have flopped something like when you have pocket aces, let's say, and you check and they bet 2/3 pot. This might be a situation where you could just call because they could just be bluffing at you with a flush draw or something like 4-5 or 7-6 or pocket 8s, 9s, or 10s, jacks, things like that. And then you're going to be able to discern on the turn and river by their betting whether or not you're beat and you want to get all the money in, or if you just need to get out of the way. Maybe they flopped a set. This is how you do that. But when they're betting small, typically that is not the best of their range, but it is things they will continue with, like the 7-6, like the flush draws, things like that. So you're going to check raise those and find that when you get it in those scenarios, facing that small bet, check raising, and then a jam, you're going to find that you're going to be up against a lot more hands that you beat with the aces than when they bet 2/3 and you check raise and they get it in.
Kings, queens. I have ace-7 here as well. Whenever you check raise ace-7 and get action, you want to have that additional 7, or you want to have the additional ace for the out, for 5 outs, compared to jacks and 10s, which only have 2 outs when you happen to be in bad shape, or, you know, depending on exactly what they have. But you have
meaning up against an overpair like jacks.
Fewer outs with jacks and tens, even though the hand strengths are basically the same. And I'm check raising the low equity flush draws. I'm not check raising these total junk hands, by the way, like jack or 10-9 of diamonds and clubs. I'm check raising some heart flush draws that are not going to fold if they get jammed on, and I'm check raising some spades that will fold if they're jammed on. So in this scenario, notice we get to have a little bit more draws compared to the previous scenario, where even though aces, kings, and queens and ace-7 are not the super nuts, they're still pretty good. They're better on this board than they were on 9-7-5. And also, the draws I'm check raising in this spot have a pretty good amount of equity, like king-8 of hearts. You get check raised, or you get shoved on with king-8 of hearts, you just got to call it off, right? And then we have some junky draws to mix in as well, so we get to have slightly more bluffs. In reality, if I had more logical bluffs to use, I probably would use them. I think that would be very viable. No, some check calling, king, queen. This could probably just be a fold. I'd have no problem with that. If it doesn't have a flush draw. So maybe if I was remaking this image right now, I would probably fold these. But I do think hands like ace-10 are usually good enough to call, but they could be folds as well. Hands like ace-8, probably like ace-10 and worse, ace-10, 9-8 without a backdoor draw should probably consider folding too. But I'm telling you, what made me want to call here is this 33% pot bet. Whenever the opponent bets tiny, I think they generally just don't follow through often enough, and they're usually just betting because you checked, at least in my poker playing experience. And if your opponent is just betting because you checked, know that you have to defend pretty wide, because they're going to have a much more linear or just junky range than what the GTO solver will have when it's betting much more polarized, right? So when the opponent's betting polarized, you should fold, or you should defend at the minimum defense frequency. And when your opponent's just betting with a wide range, you do need to defend more, because if you take my whole preflop range against their whole preflop range, we're in pretty good shape. But if you take my preflop range against their betting range, or you take my checking range on the flop against their betting range, we should fold out our junk a little bit more. So anyway, in this scenario, I was folding 19%. Solver folds substantially more, 34%, which does make sense, right? And like I said, the hands that it's folding out are like king, queen, no backdoor draw, ace, jack, 10, 9, 8. So it's folding even like I said I'd probably call ace, jack, but it's folding ace, jack without a backdoor draw. So that makes sense. And as I said, if I was remaking this image, I probably would have folded a little bit more. So good. Solver does check raise all the overpairs like I showed. Well, not all, but a lot of the overpairs like I showed. Remember here, the overpairs are actually checked a lot on the flop, so that's important to note. Also interesting to note, Solver check calls aces more than it check calls kings, but it check raises kings more than it check raises tens. So we have tens and aces using almost the same strategy, which is kind of counterintuitive. Usually what you see is either just the best overpairs check raising, or the overpairs that are vulnerable to being outdrawn raising, but for some reason in this scenario it's using exactly the medium ones to raise and the best ones and the worst ones to call. Not that overpairs are bad, but you know, the worst overpairs to call. So neat scenario.
I think the reason why it's doing that with the tens is because hands like the 8-9 of hearts and stuff like this, they're less likely to stick around. You know what I'm saying? Like hands like 10 jack. You know what I'm saying? Like there's less combinations of 10 jack because you have two tens in your hand. So when you check raise it, you're less likely to be drawn out on by 10 jack in this scenario than you are versus the with the tens than you are when you don't have the tens, because when it comes out running 8-9, you have to decrease the odds that your opponent has a 10 in his hand. Having 2 in your hand, you know, cuts that down by 2/3. So there's just far less combinations. I think from what I've seen, that's why Solver mirrors aces versus tens here, because somebody having 10 jack, this is going to be very similar, but the hand strength gets weaker with the tens, because now they can hit a jack on you if they have jack 10 and you have tens. When they have jacks, you can actually raise more often and call less, because of the fact that there's less chance to get drawn out on. It has to go perfect 8-9, and when you have the 2 jacks in your hand, you take away the combination of 10 jacks. So it's just one of those little things that the solver kind of sees that is totally not implementable, but if you understand why the solver does it, it makes sense as to why it's playing aces the same as tens, because it's taking away combinations of the most common scenario that will backdoor straight on you.
But again, solver strategy is kind of...
It's also why you're seeing more with sixes than you are with fives here just slightly because of the fact of having the 6 takes away combinations of 5-6 and 6-8.
Kind of convoluted. It has to deal with blockers and equity and how ranges interact perfectly, and it's going to be very, very difficult for us mere humans to figure that out. So use a strategy like this. Like I said, maybe call a little bit less with king, queen, ace, 10, 9, 8. But everything else here looks very, very good. I know this was a lot of examples. I know they came at you kind of quick. If you have any questions about this, definitely go back and rewatch this section. But this is how you want to play when you are checking out a position. Essentially, when you're checking a very condensed strategy, meaning you don't have the best hands and the draws, or they make up a very small portion of your range, you want to do a lot of check calling. But as you have more effective nut hands that you're happy getting in with for 40 big blinds, you should be doing more check raising. It is worth mentioning, as you're deeper and deeper stacked, you should probably check raise a little bit less, unless you're, of course, very deep, because then you can barrel, turn, and river more often with your draws. But with something like 70 big blinds, you should likely consider check raising even a little bit less, because you don't want to check raise a hand like a7 and then get re-raised, because then you're in very bad shape in a spot like this. But this is a very strong strategy. If you were to use this strategy across the board, playing 40 big blinds or deeper, it's probably just going to be fine. And again, I am not trying to teach you some very, very difficult strategy that's impossible to implement. We are learning here a strategy that you can implement at the table logically, and you're going to be playing very, very great.
And it's one of those interesting things where 40 big blinds is where it becomes, you start looking for scenarios to pull away from the pack. So if you're at 40 big blinds and you're a few hours into a tournament, using strategies like this and getting the money in favorable scenarios is really good, because that's how you go on to win tournaments. That's like you said, using a 100 big blind strategy doing this is kind of different, because getting that much action at 100 big blinds is far different than getting it at 40. You're out of position as a pre-flop raiser. What type of hands should you check raise? Select all that apply. The premium made hands and the draws. Premium hands and draws, get more money in the pot immediately. Protect your hands and don't give anything away. Have backdoor outs when you're going for the bluff. When you're out of position, pre-flop raiser, should you check more high card boards or low card boards? Well, I would imagine you would be checking more high card boards. No, low card. Oh, this is the frequency thing again, because I'm not going to be betting the low card boards as much. I need to be checking them more, so therefore that will lead to more check raising. Okay. Out of position as a pre-flop raiser, should you check raise more on high card boards or low card boards? Out of position as the pre-flop raiser. Oh, I guess low, right? Yeah, because you're going to have more checks on these boards. All right, just what we just said. The market is complete. Those word questions, man, they get me fucked up. I think this is the second to last. There should be one more section in this pre-flop part here. Yeah, as the pre-flop raiser in position, facing a bet. Okay. Let's get through this.
Now let's discuss as the pre-flop raiser in position when you are facing a bet. Okay? This means that you were led into, or they donked into you. And you're going to find that leading is a very rare action from the GTO point of view. So when your opponent makes this play...
This is my number one clue on WSOP as to the level of the players, is that there is a lot of donk leading. And for the most part, about 70% of the time, maybe even more, it is just people creating scenarios in their head. I raised in the cutoff, they've called it in the big blind, and they lead out on a 10 high flop. Because their logic is just saying, well, if you don't have a 10, you can't call. Right. But then I just raise every time I see that, and they fold going, well, he must have an overpair. And it just makes them throw away so many hands that would have good ability to check call me, like second pair, backdoor, flush draws, things like that. But instead, they've just given up the ghost and made the pot too big to continue. So it's my number one clue as to the level of play that I'm up against currently on WSOP at 10 and L.
They are making either an exploitive play or a bad play. So you want to try to figure out what your opponent's doing wrong and exploit them. So now your opponent's player type is very, 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 very important. Whenever they do lead, now you have more information before acting. And quite often they are announcing that their range is capped. You're going to find that the vast majority of the people, when they lead, do not have the best made hands, although sometimes they will. They usually have a marginal made hand or junk, or perhaps a draw. Also, your opponents probably announce they're not very good. And in this scenario, if you don't know what your opponent's doing, you should usually just use the bet response flowchart, which says you should be raising your best made hands and your draws when you have the nut advantage, and you should be calling when you don't. And you should be calling with your marginal made hands, and you should be folding with your junk. Nice and easy, right? We've already discussed how to do that plenty. We're not going to go into that. However, if you know how your opponent plays, if you know which specific type of hand they are leading with, you can adjust and exploit them accordingly. So, if your opponent leads with premium made hands only, you know that they like leading when they have the nuts. Well, now we want to fold our non-nut hands besides exactly the draws that are getting the right odds to call. Because think about it, right? If they're leading with the nuts and I raise them, that's clearly not going to work out great for me. So you want to call with the draws, you want to fold your marginal made hands, and you want to fold your junk, right? If you have the nuts yourself, like say you actually have the real nuts, you probably do want to go ahead and raise and get your money in. If you raise here, by the way, and your opponent folds, it means your read is wrong. Sometimes your reads are going to be wrong and you should adjust. If you have like second or third nuts, it's probably right just to go into bluff catcher mode and call down. So don't think that if you have something like aces and it comes 7-6-3, if your opponent leads there, you should just call if you think they lead with mostly premium hands. If your opponent leads with marginal made hands that they will not fold, say it comes 7-6-3 and they lead with 8-7 and they just will never ever fold it if you raise them, you should then in turn raise with your premium hands and call with your marginal made hands that are in okay shape, either they slightly better or slightly worse, and you should call with your draws. You should again fold all of your junk. There's no point in bluffing someone who's not going to fold, right? What if your opponent leads with made hands that they will fold if you raise? A lot of people will lead stuff like middle pair with the idea that they're going to either fold it immediately if they get raised because you told them they were beat, or they're going to call your flop raise but then fold to a turn plus river bet. Against those players, you want to call with your absolute best hands because you don't want them to fold because they are dead or nearly dead. And you want to raise everything else. Your marginal made hands, you want to raise because you're going to win the pot. With your draws, you want to raise because you're going to win the pot. With your junk, you want to raise. This is where a lot of people are not willing to get out of line and be overly exploitative. But say it does come 7-6-3 and you know your opponent leads with a lot of middle pair and bottom pair type hands, and you're sitting here with king jack no draw, you should raise. You should put your opponents in terrible spots because they are going to fold either to the flop raise, the turn bet, or the river jam. You need to be willing to go for it too. Don't be a chicken and chicken out. What if your opponent leads with draws? Well, now you actually want to raise with everything unless they're going to rip it in with their draws, and then you want to keep betting on safe turns that don't complete the draws. If they're going to re-raise all in with their draws, then you just want to raise with your best hands and your best draws. With your marginal made hands that are roughly 50-50 against the draws, you probably want to call and then raise them on safe turns, right? And if your opponent leads with junk, you want to call with your premium made hands and strong marginal made hands that are not susceptible to being outdrawn and just raise them with everything else because they're going to fold. So I want to make this really clear. In all these scenarios, every single one of them, the opponent plays poorly. They are making some sort of egregious error where their bet very clearly indicates what they have. A lot of people think that if your opponents play poorly, that strategy goes out the window. But in reality, as you can see here, if you know what your opponent does wrong, poker is actually really, really easy. Because all you have to do is figure out what you want to accomplish and then do it, right? So understand that you need to be making exploitative adjustments based on what your opponent's doing correctly, based on what you witness. If you're playing online, based on what your heads-up display tells you. And you will be able to absolutely crush your opponents. This is why live poker, especially at the small and medium stakes, is so incredibly profitable. It's because you're going to witness your opponents making these blunders over and over, and you have to be observant enough and willing enough to get out of line and exploit them. When your opponents play poorly and you take advantage of it, you are going to make a ton of money. What a lot of people do wrong is they just keep playing the GTO strategy, or the fundamentally sound strategy we've outlined previously, And, you know, that'll still win, but I'd rather you win a ton. So when you find your opponents making big errors, you need to adjust accordingly.
I think that was the problem I was having last week with WSOP cash games, is that I was staying way too close to the GTO actions and not adjusting accordingly, and seeing a lot of these donk lead out bets. It was just so bad, but I didn't consider what was going on. So I think that was a mistake I was making. Which of these is true? If your opponent leads with draws, you should raise with everything and keep betting on safe turns. Yeah. If your opponent leads with premium hands, you should fold non-nut hands unless you have great odds to call. That's true. If your opponent leads with marginal hands that they will not fold, you should raise your premium hands and call marginal made hands and draws. Yeah, that's all true. Yep. If your opponent leads with junk and bluffs, you should raise with everything from premium to drunk. Well, I mean, I guess with premium, no, right? Yeah. You should call the premium and the strong marginal made hands that don't need protection and raise everything else, right? We're going to mark this as complete. I believe this completes the pre-flop section of when facing a bet. If it does, huzzah. And we've completed another section. Yep, it did. Okay, so we've completed this section now. We get to mark it as complete, finally. Took about 5 sessions to get through that, and then this will be the next session when facing a check raise, and we could probably get through this in 1 or 2 sessions. I am going to put these 2 episodes that happened today together into one and post it on YouTube. They'll be on here as Wake Up With Me number 84, Flop Strategy When Facing a Bet Part 5 and or Part 5A and Part 5B. But you can just go over to YouTube, check out the whole thing in one shot. New YouTube content coming all the time. I'm going to end this stream, take a shower, eat, and play some cash games tonight. My in-laws were here kind of longer, so it kind of threw my day off, but no big deal. Thanks for coming out, guys. I appreciate it. And this is important stuff. Seems very dense. I would suggest rewatching this a lot. Go to the YouTube and get it all in one shot there. I'll see you guys in a little while. Have a great day.